starting things off today, planting cover crops can have several benefits for crop producers, including weed and pest prevention, better soil health, and additional nutrients for successive cash crops. Now the UNL NRCS Soil Health Initiative is taking things to new heights, literally. Through the use of aerial imagery, researchers are learning valuable lessons about cover crop biomass, as well as their potential impact on cash crop growth and development. Market Journal's Bill Dodd has the story.
More and more recently, many crop producers and researchers have been utilizing aerial imagery to study fields in order to make more informed management decisions. While primarily researching how different management systems can impact soil quality, by getting a bird's eye view and utilizing different imagery tools, UNL researchers, with the assistance of Nebraska Natural Resources Conservation Service and on-farm research participants, have been able to glean a slightly better insight into the impacts of specific management practices as it pertains to cover crop production.
In this project, we have imposed treatments, so we can actually see the difference between some of the practices that farmers are using. So again, if that's no cover crop compared to cover crop, or different planting dates with cover crop, different cover crop varieties or different species that they're using, or all those things we can see in a picture over the course of the cover crop growing season as well as into the cash crop growing season. So with these articles, we did two things. One was to compare field measurements that we took of the amount of growth in the field to a vegetation index, the NDVI, to see how well those aligned. And we found that we were able to detect differences between management practices, so differences in cover crop planting dates. Earlier planting dates resulted in more cover crop biomass. We could see that higher NDVI value, or a cover crop that was grazed that had less biomass in the spring compared to no grazing, we could see that difference in NDVI as well. So that's pretty exciting that the imagery can validate what we see on the ground in terms of the amount of biomass aligning with a vegetation index that we've calculated.
Beyond analyzing cover crop growth and management practices, another potential application for this particular imagery practice would also be a better understanding of how much cover crops can impact subsequent cash crops during the growing season.
So we get those images every 1 to 2 weeks during the growing season, and we can see on those treatments what's happening after the cover crop has been terminated. And what we found in one of the farms that we looked at in 2019, one of our collaborators, was really interesting, was that this producer who was growing soybean after a cereal rye cover crop, was that the soybean grown in the areas of the field that had a cover crop, the NDVI value was actually lower than the areas that did not have a cover crop. Okay, so what that indicated to us is that likely the canopy had not closed as quickly in the areas following the cover crop compared to no cover crop. But by the end of the season, that pattern actually flipped, so that the NDVI values were higher in the cover crop, the areas of the field that had the cover crop. So there was some developmental difference with the soybeans following the cover crop and no cover crop. That the soybeans following the no cover crop actually had senesced more quickly. And so that's why there was a lower NDVI value by September. But the very interesting thing was that there was no difference in grain quality or in grain yield. So even though we could see that the cover crop was having some potential effect on the soybean developmentally during the year, that did not lead to any difference in yield.
While the potential applications of this study are exciting, there's still much work to be done when it comes to turning this raw data into a viable management practice or reliable diagnostic indicators.
One thing to keep in mind is that we are still at the early stages of this project in terms to understand how we can turn that in a management decision. But our first step was to see if with aerial imagery, remote sensing, we could detect both cover crop biomass production and also its effect on the subsequent cash crop. So that was one of the positive aspects that we saw that we could use remote sensing. And then the second question that would be how farmers can apply that information. That's something we are still thinking about it, but how I see in the long-term horizon is, for example, using that information for site-specific cover crop management, for example, the same way as farmers use nitrogen prescription maps. Why we cannot use the same concept for cover crop? But that's something that will take some time, but that's how I see in the long term how farmers can use that information to apply to their fields.
By using a non-destructive and easily applied method of imagery, the study has shown that we're able to develop a better understanding of cover crop biomass production across an entire field. This would be much more difficult with more traditional sampling methods. While there's still much work to be done, the potential applications for this practice are worth keeping an eye on. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Bill Dodd.